church benches and into the trenches. Let's make a righteous ruckus.
Hi, welcome back to this episode of the Righteous Ruckus podcast. I'm your host, Riley Lowe, and a follow-up on a podcast I did here a while back regarding truth and kind of starting to delve into apologetics a little bit. I got some good feedback from that, and it seems like more people wanted to hear about apologetics, so I'm trying to keep it as surface level as I can, guys. My goal with apologetics is to equip you to be not on your heels whenever somebody starts confronting you with these arguments or questions you about these different angles on what people question about God. So my goal is to have you be equipped so you'll be confident, have a spine of steel to be able to refute, and also it really helps boost your belief as to why you believe what you believe, if that makes sense. So you will be able to be more confident and more bold as you live your life throughout the world. So before I get into it, I do want to give a quick plug to a company called ClearPlay. Right? I talked about them on the last podcast when I was talking about protecting your kids. They actually reached out to me, and they created this landing page where if you go to it and you sign up, it's really super affordable, but it's a streaming service that allows you to basically filter out movies, just your normal movies, to where you can have no language, no sex scenes, and you can set the level of violence that you're willing to accept. So your kids can enjoy, like movies that you watched when you were a kid, or current movies, but they can be filtered to where they're, safe as can be for kids these days. Anyway, so I'll put the link below and in the description, whatever, and you can go check them out. I appreciate it. I'm not like in a partnership with them or anything. I don't get any kickback from that. I just thought it was awesome that they reached out and they offered to do that for me for this podcast. So, and I think it's a great tool. So there you go. So the moral argument, I've got a lot of notes here. Right? I'm going to try to keep this as dumbed down as possible because I am dumbed down myself. So the moral argument for the existence of God, it's referring to the claim that God is needed to provide a coherent foundation for the existence of objective moral values and duties. All right, so that's a big sentence. I actually left out a big word in there just to try to keep this surface level. So the argument basically goes something like this. Now, this is called a syllogism. Now, there's a big word, right? This is basically just premise one, premise two, conclusion. You've seen this stuff before, I'm sure. So premise one is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise number two is, objective moral values and duties do exist. So the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. It's as simple as that. That's basically okay. So if there is no objective moral values, then there doesn't have to be God. Now, there could be God, but there doesn't have to be. But there are objective moral values, so God exists. So, since that's called a syllogism, since it's logically valid, if you're an atheist, in order to maintain your non-belief in God, you'd have to reject one of those, but you'd have to say, well, God doesn't exist. Okay, well, then where does your objective moral values come from? All right, so by objective morality, I'm talking about, here's a system of ethics which universally pertains to all people, irregardless of your opinions or your tastes, right? And irregardless of the opinions and tastes of certain people. So, for example, the Holocaust was morally wrong, irregardless of what Hitler and the Nazis believed about it. And it would have remained morally wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and compelled every single person in the world to comply with their values. Their values would still be morally wrong. All right? This is not a majority rule thing. This is having a standard above ourselves, right? So most people in premise number two there, most people upholds the premise two, right? Which is objective moral values and duties do exist, right? Because after all, if there are no objective ethics or moral values, then who's to say that Hitler attempting to eradicate the Jews was objectively morally wrong? Humans have an intuitive sense of right and wrong. It's called your conscience, right? Now your conscience can be seared to a point where you don't care about the right and the wrong. But we all, at least at some point in our lives, start off with a conscious and knowing just within ourselves, that something is right or wrong. The moral argument, it doesn't require that we know everything that's right and wrong and apply it to every situation. Basically, if there's at least one thing, one action that's objectively right or wrong. So example would be, it's objectively wrong to torture babies for pleasure, right? That's objectively wrong. So that's what I'm talking about. That right there, there's nobody would say, well, no, I could see in a situation where torturing babies for pleasure would be objectively right. It'd be good. Nobody's going to say that. So, that's just one of many scenarios that you can come up with where there's something that's objectively wrong. Everybody would agree across the board that is wrong to do. And so, even the people that would do it would know that it's wrong. But premise one being, if God does not exist and objective moral values and duties do not exist, that relates to the perfect standard against which everything else is measured. Right? So we're measuring our actions against a standard to determine whether they're morally right or wrong. And what I mean by that, so basically C.S. Lewis put it this way when he said, quote, "My argument against God," which he started off as an atheist, right? So he's talking about when he didn't believe there was a God. He said, "My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust." You'll hear people talk about that, right? What about this evil? "But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust?" In other words, he's saying there has to be a standard. If a line is crooked, you have to have a standard line. You got to know what a straight line is to know if something's crooked or not. It's just the way it is. Think about if you're trying to straighten up a picture and you've got a level, you can put that level up there and that level's your standard. If you don't have that level and you don't know where you're at, you can eyeball it and you can think you've got an idea, and somebody can walk by and go, "Well, that's crooked." You can say, "Well, no, that's not." You've each got your own idea. It's just the way it is. So basically, outside of God or theism, nobody's been able to conceive of a defensible grounding for where moral values come from. People say, "Oh, well, we evolved them." What for? "Oh, well, for the propagation of society. What's best for society." Well, if you have no moral compass and moral standard outside yourself, and really just propagation of a species is the only thing that you're talking about, well, then what you end up with is it'd be perfectly acceptable to just go raping women everywhere, right? Because you're propagating the species. If that's the goal, then it's not wrong to do that, because that's the goal. That's a good way of making more people, right? But we all know it's wrong to do that, though. So the thing is, can you do good without God? Can you do good without God? Well, really, anybody can do good without believing in God. You don't have to believe in God to save a kid from drowning, right? You don't have to believe in God to do that. However, we're not talking about doing good, but rather, why is it objectively good to do so? Here's the deal. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of knowing what's up, what's down, like the straight line and crooked line that C.S. Lewis talked about. All right. So God's nature gives us that objective reference point. How we find God's nature, we find that in what he says, in God's word, which is called the Bible. But if there's no God, then there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is just one person's viewpoint, which is really no more valid than another person's viewpoint. And that would make all morality subjective and not objective, which would put us kind of where we're at today with, people will call it it's called moral relativism. Instead of being morally subjective, they'll call it moral relativism, and they'll say, oh, well, I mean, what's true for you is not true for me, and just because you say that doesn't mean that that's wrong. I can determine what's right and wrong for myself, and it just leads to a total state of chaos. It's like a preference for a flavor of ice cream. If I say I like chocolate and you say you like vanilla, that's just subjective. That's rooted in the ice cream, in our personal preference, not in subject to our personal preference, not in a standard anywhere. It'd be kind of like, that's not like saying 2 + 2 = 5, but we know that's wrong. We know that 2 + 2 = 4 is right. Well, why? Because we have a standard, a mathematical standard, and we know, and you can take 2 and 2 and you can count them and say that's 4, not 5. And even if everybody in the whole world said that adds up to 5, that doesn't mean that it really does add up to 5. All right. So in a world without God, there can be, this is as Richard Dawkins put it, he's a famous atheist, right? He said, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, right? I think he even said, we just dance to the tune of our DNA, right? There's nothing right, nothing wrong, and that's what you end up with if you follow down that trail of atheism. Now, I've heard Frank Turek summarize the subjective relative morality as kind of something along the lines of, if there is no standard of morality to hold people to, then really Mother Teresa and Hitler, their actions were no different than each other. They're just actions. There is no right, there is no wrong. They're just actions. And people inherently know that that's a jacked up way of viewing the world, but a lot of people still choose to do it that way. But I mean, an important distinction to make is to remember that, and this is where people will try to trip you up if you get to talking down this at all, is we got to talk about what we're meaning by the moral argument, right? It's pertaining to the ultimate source of objective moral values and duties, and not how we know them, right? And not what we mean by good or bad, or right or wrong, right? We know as Christians that moral values are grounded in the true character and nature of God. Our moral duties are based on what God commands. So there's a philosopher, a lot of people are probably familiar with him, William Lane Craig. He put it this way: duty arises in response to an imperative from a competent authority. So, for example, here, that's a lot of big words there. For example, if some random person were to tell me to pull my car over, I would have absolutely no legal obligation to do so. But if a police officer were to issue the same command, I'd have a legal obligation to obey. The difference in those two is in the person who issues the commands. One is qualified to do so while the other is not. So where do we get God's standard? Like I said, we get it from the Word of God. So God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands in the Bible, right? They provide the basis for all moral duties. For example, this is just one example here. There's a ton of them. But God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to, quote, love your neighbor as yourself. We're all familiar with that. Now, that's Luke 10:27 is one spot where that's found. So this command provides the foundation which we can, affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, equality, things like that. And we know that the opposite is wrong, and we can condemn that, such as greed, abuse, discrimination, based on your race and things like that. As we know that those things are all wrong. All right. And sometimes a lot of people they conflate all this stuff, right? And so sometimes people they'll object and they'll say, is something good just because God wills it? Or does God will something because it's good? And you say, oh man, that's a good one. That's a tough one. Is it good because God says it, or does God say it because it's good? They're trying to get you to say that God is not the standard. That's what that's designed to do. But the reality is, it's neither of those things. That's what's called a false dichotomy, right? And in philosophy. And so God wills it or says it or commands it because he is good. He doesn't say it because it's good, and it's not good because he says it. He says the good thing because he is good. That is his nature. All right. So God's the standard of moral values. Just it's kind of like think about like a musician is the standard for their recording, right? If you were to download a song these days, or you go back in the day and play a cassette tape or an 8-track or a record of this recording, right? The closer it matches the original artist, their source, the better it is, right? So it's the same sort of deal there. The closer a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. Because if atheism's true, then there is no ultimate standard, and there can be no moral obligations or duties. There's no moral obligations or duties. Because in that situation, if there's no standard, then who or what gives us moral duties or obligations? Nobody. That's the thing. If there is no standard, then everybody, the Bible says they did what was right in their own eyes. That's what we're seeing in the world around us, is everybody just does whatever they feel like and whatever's right in their own eyes. All right. So it's important to remember that for the atheists, humans, their worldview, especially for the, there's some of them that will say there's something beyond physical, but there's also just like, what's the term is, I think, materialist. And that's basically saying that all we are is atoms and molecules and matter, and that's it. So, in the atheistic worldview, humans are just accidents of nature, basically, right? We're moist robots or highly evolved animals, right? That's all we are. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. If a lion kills a zebra, the lion hasn't done anything wrong. The lion's just doing what a lion does. And so if God doesn't exist, then we should view human behavior in the same way. And that's what the atheistic worldview leads to. No action is considered morally right or wrong. Everybody just does their thing. Like I said earlier, the actions of Mother Teresa are no different than the actions of Adolf Hitler. That's just the reality in a atheistic worldview. But the problem is good and bad, right and wrong do exist. And just as our senses, our physical senses, tell us that the physical world exists, our moral senses and the fact that there's objective morality tells us that objective morality is real, right? Every time somebody says, hey, and this happens all the time now, but this is the thing. Every time somebody says, hey, that's not fair, or that's an injustice, or that's wrong, then they're actually affirming the existence of objective morality, right? Because they're saying they're appealing to a standard without even realizing it. They're saying that is wrong. They're not saying, I think that's wrong. They're saying that is wrong. If you just walk down the street and you just sucker punch somebody in the face for no reason, everybody's going to say, dude, that's wrong. Why'd you do that? That's jacked up. Well, you can say, well, is it really wrong? What standard are you basing this on? Well, and they can come up with a whole line of things. Oh, this is just the standard that people have generally agreed to, or whatever. No, they're actually trying to appeal to a universal standard, an objective standard that's beyond us. All right, and so I know the moral argument can get kind of deep, but like I said, I'm trying to keep it surface level. So to wrap it up, the moral argument is a huge argument for the existence of God because it really appeals to everybody's, I don't know, their conscious, their subconscious, what they feel in their heart, right? That the whole world today is all about feelings. So it's a powerful thing to be like, hey, so where does right and wrong, good and bad come from? And what standard are you judging that off of? It's a good thought exercise to get into thinking about that. But it's also important to make the distinction between the source of the morality, which is called ontology, and how we know it. which is called epistemology. Right? Those are just two fancy words to say the source and how we know it. Atheists will often default that over to people that don't believe in God will default over to this is how we know it. We've just agreed to this and it's just something that's been passed down. No, we're talking about the source. We're talking about why is it good? Where does this good come from? Right and wrong. Where does this standard come from? That's the crux of the situation there. So, they'll conflate that stuff all the time. And if you're not careful to kind of think about that, you can get sucked right into that. But humans, we have inherent value because we're shaped and made in the image of God. And so we've got an intuitive sense of right and wrong. And it's really not at all clear how an atheist can maintain an objective standard of ethics without such a being as God and him being the foundation of morality. Because, like I said, they're not putting their foundation in anything. It's just nebulous, right? And so, like I said, I know apologetics can be deep sometimes, but it can really transform your thought process and the way of thinking, and it can really boost your confidence when you get into a conversation where people just throw out these things and the thing is, when you really get down to the bottom of it, most of the people that are going to be throwing these things at you, they don't know where these things come from or haven't thought past just, this is what I need to say to get this Christian to shut up. That's what they almost always are. That's their aim. They think, oh, this is a gotcha question. It'll get you to be quiet and it'll show that I'm superior. Well, the reality is they usually just parroting some little catchphrase that they've heard somewhere. And when you really start pushing them, they won't have answers. And so the reality is by thinking through this stuff and learning about this stuff, you can go from being the person. This is not about winning an argument here. This is just about being prepared and making somebody go, oh, I've never thought about that. I'm not talking about being super confrontational and saying, oh, you listen here, Mr. Atheist, I'm right. You listen here, or laughing at their face and saying, oh, see, you ain't got no answer for that now, do you? No, that's not the goal here. The goal is to just say, well, have you ever thought about it this way? And let's talk about this. Let's talk about what standard are you using? What standard are you using? And it can really help you be, like I said, it can stiffen your spine and just help you to go into those sort of, I don't know if you want to call them confrontations or conversations, just more boldly and more prepared. And by being prepared, you can a lot of times be more convincing for one thing, but also you can help raise somebody's curiosity by saying, whoa, I've never had a Christian, pose that to me before. Maybe they know something. That's a good answer I've never considered. And a lot of times they've never been put back on their heels and had to actually think about what they've said and had what they've said questioned. They just love questioning what the Christian says, right? But by doing that, a lot of times you're able to really open their mind and broaden their horizons. And that's the whole goal, is to get them to question and hopefully and prayerfully have them come to the Lord. That's the ultimate goal, is to make heaven crowded, to get as many people as we can to the finish line, and to have as many people as we can to enter into the kingdom of God at the rapidly approaching end of times, right? That's the end game. So let's get out there and let's get to work.